question did not sound dramatic, and that was precisely why it landed so hard, because it was framed as a simple clarification rather than an accusation, a yes or no inquiry that forced a reckoning between image and reality. When a lawmaker builds an entire public identity around economic justice, symbolism stops being decorative and starts functioning like evidence, whether intended or not. So when the words "tax the rich" were stitched onto a designer gown worn inside one of the most exclusive events in America, the slogan ceased to be abstract and became transactional. In that moment, the debate was no longer about art or messaging or cultural disruption, but about alignment between personal conduct and public claims. That alignment, once questioned in front of the people most affected by rising costs and shrinking margins, becomes the fulcrum on which political credibility either holds or collapses. This was not staged in a sterile Washington studio insulated from consequence, but in the Bronx, where politics is not consumed as ideology, but experienced as rent, transit delays, medical bills, and jobs that do not stretch far enough. The audience was not a panel of pundits trained to convert conflict into ratings, but residents who could instantly translate slogans into groceries and electricity. They did not arrive to be entertained, because entertainment does not lower their bills, and they did not arrive to be inspired, because inspiration does not stabilize their futures. They arrived because they had watched their representative become a national figure, while their own lives felt increasingly small and constrained. And in that setting, every word spoken on stage was measured not by its rhetorical polish, but by whether it acknowledged or dismissed their lived arithmetic. The framing of the exchange mattered as much as its content, because it unfolded less like a debate of policy preferences and more like an audit of coherence. The calm, methodical tone of the questioning stripped away the usual defenses available in televised sparring, where passion can be mistaken for substance and volume can mask contradiction. Here, the questions were designed to narrow rather than expand, to corner rather than to roam, and to force continuity between past images and present claims. This style does not require shouting, because it relies on the audience's own capacity to connect dots that have already been placed in front of them. And once those dots form a pattern, no amount of performative indignation can easily erase it. The tension in the room did not come from hostility alone, but from recognition, because many of the people listening had defended the Congresswoman to friends, co-workers, and relatives. They had explained that symbolism matters, that progress is slow, and that disruption requires visibility, even if that visibility is uncomfortable. They had argued that representation in elite spaces could be a form of infiltration rather than surrender, and that moral clarity does not require personal austerity. But those defenses rely on trust, and trust weakens when the distance between messenger and message starts to feel structural rather than incidental. When that happens, the audience does not need to be persuaded. It only needs permission to admit what it has already begun to suspect. The question about the dress was effective not because it was cruel, but because it was comparative. It implicitly asked whether moral authority comes from intent or from consequence, and whether symbolism can override participation in the very hierarchy being criticized. In American political culture, authenticity is not measured by ideological purity, but by whether voters believe a leader would live under the rules they propose for others. That belief is fragile, and once damaged, it is rarely repaired through explanation alone. Instead, it demands a visible willingness to accept the same constraints that ordinary people face without choice. What followed in the exchange was not a rush toward condemnation, but a slow accumulation of contrasts designed to test that belief. Each contrast invited the audience to perform a private calculation. comparing the abstractions of political language with the textures of their own routines. This method is particularly powerful in an era dominated by social media, where identity is curated and context is compressed into images. When a political figure thrives in that environment, their images become part of their argument, even when they would prefer those images to remain ornamental. Once that threshold is crossed, every photograph, tweet, and headline becomes fair terrain for scrutiny, not because of malice, but because of the logic of modern representation. The opening movement of the confrontation established a theme that would echo through everything that followed: the difference between speaking for struggle and being insulated from it. This distinction does not accuse anyone of malice by default, because insulation can arise from success as much as from betrayal. But it does raise a fundamental question about accountability, particularly when success is achieved while campaigning against the very systems that produced it. In democratic politics, voters rarely punish ambition itself, but they are quick to punish what feels like moral asymmetry. If sacrifice is demanded rhetorically but avoided personally, the language of justice begins to sound like branding rather than conviction. The setting amplified this tension because the Bronx is not a symbolic backdrop. It is a place where economic stress is routine rather than exceptional. Families there do not debate inequality in the abstract, because they live inside its margins every day. For them, politics is not a performance to be consumed, but a promise that either materializes or does not. When that promise is articulated through sweeping moral claims, expectations rise accordingly. And when those expectations are disappointed, the disappointment is not ideological, but personal. The opening phase of the exchange therefore functioned as a mirror rather than a hammer. It reflected back an image that many supporters had previously accepted as harmless or even clever, and asked whether that acceptance still held under closer inspection. This is why the room fell quiet rather than erupting, because silence often signals internal recalibration rather than immediate rejection. People were not deciding what to think about the Congresswoman in that instant. They were deciding whether their prior explanations still felt honest. That internal process is slow, uncomfortable, and resistant to slogans, which is why it is so politically dangerous once triggered. What made the moment resonate beyond the room was not the cleverness of the question, but its timing. Economic pressure had already eroded patience for perceived contradictions, and inflation had sharpened sensitivity to displays of comfort and ease. In such conditions, voters are less willing to separate symbolism from substance because their own lives offer no such separation. Every expense carries weight, every choice has consequence, and every indulgence requires justification. When a leader appears exempt from that logic, resentment does not need to be taught. It emerges organically. This opening did not conclude with a verdict, because its function was not to close the case but to open it. It established the lens through which subsequent claims would be interpreted, anchoring them in questions of alignment rather than ideology. From that point forward, each example, statistic, and anecdote would be filtered through a single inquiry. Does the conduct match the claim? Once that inquiry is activated, rebuttals that rely on intention rather than outcome lose much of their force. The stage was set not for a shouting match, but for a methodical examination of credibility under economic stress. The core subject of this analysis is not whether Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is good or bad, because moral labeling is cheap and politics is rarely that clean, but whether a media-driven political persona can survive sustained scrutiny when it is tested in front of the voters who feel the economic squeeze most intensely. The second subject is Ted Cruz, not as a hero or villain, but as a practitioner of adversarial persuasion, a politician-lawyer who understands that credibility is often decided less by policy white papers than by optics, incentives, and perceived hypocrisy. The third subject is the audience itself, the Bronx constituents as a stand-in for working-class political judgment, because the audience in your scene is not consuming ideology as entertainment, but using it to evaluate trust, dignity, and whether they are being used as props. The problem being analyzed is therefore a three-way collision between representation, performance, and material reality, where each side is using a different definition of legitimacy and expecting the others to accept it. And the reason this collision feels explosive is that the Met Gala image, the salary discussion, the HQ2 jobs dispute, the grandmother story, and the climate sacrifice argument all point to a single unresolved tension. Who bears costs? Who receives benefits? And who gets to define what solidarity looks like in practice? Start with the Met Gala moment, because it functions as the opening exhibit not due to its legislative importance, but because it is an image that compresses a broader argument into a single frame that ordinary people can interpret without needing policy expertise. AOC's defense, in the best version of her argument, is that politics is partly cultural power, that cultural power shapes policy outcomes, and that inserting a redistributive message into an elite setting can broaden attention and force uncomfortable conversations. Cruz's counter-argument, in the best version of his argument, is that participation in elite spectacle still reads as participation, and that a slogan does not cancel the social meaning of the room, the ticket price, the photographers, and the status network surrounding the moment. The audience reaction is not merely partisan. It is a function of comparative stress, because symbolism feels tolerable when people feel stable, but symbolism feels insulting when people feel broke, exhausted, and unseen. So the Met Gala becomes less a debate about art and more a debate about whether the representative is living the critique or simply staging it. Which is why the question, "Were you taxing yourself?" works as a rhetorical trap that shortens the distance between satire and self-indictment. The next layer is what the Met Gala image triggers psychologically, because the critique is rarely about one night and almost always about a pattern the audience thinks it recognizes. For supporters, the pattern is visibility used to fight entrenched power, a story where attention is currency and every platform is an opportunity to push structural reform. For critics, the pattern is performative politics as a career ladder, a story where moral language is branding and elite access is the payoff for adopting the right rhetoric. In your scene, Cruz tries to move the audience from the supporter pattern into the critic pattern by insisting the image is not an isolated contradiction, but a representative sample of how modern political fame operates. And the audience is vulnerable to that reframing because their own lives supply constant reminders that they do not have the luxury of symbolic consumption, since their choices are constrained by cost, time, and risk in ways a national celebrity politician may not share. This is where the adversarial strategy becomes important, because Cruz is not trying to win an academic argument about socialism, capitalism, or redistributive taxation. He is trying to win an argument about authenticity, which is always more emotional than logical, because authenticity is about whether voters feel respected rather than whether a policy memo is internally consistent. AOC's media skill in this construction is that she can translate structural critique into viral language that makes supporters feel seen, especially younger voters for whom political identity is intertwined with digital community and moral signaling. Cruz's media skill in this construction is that he can translate elite symbolism into a feeling of contempt, making the audience believe they are being lectured by someone enjoying comforts they are told they should not pursue. The confrontation becomes a contest over which emotional truth the audience adopts. She's using power to fight for us, or she's using us to gain power. And once the second frame takes hold, almost every subsequent example feels like confirmation rather than information. The money and lifestyle segment, if written responsibly, must be treated as a legitimacy argument rather than a criminal allegation, because politicians earn salaries and live in expensive cities is not scandal by itself. Yet the reason the segment still lands is that salary becomes an empathy test when paired with rhetoric that implies the wealthy are morally suspect, because people hear the condemnation and immediately ask whether it applies to the speaker as well. AOC's best defense is that compensation is set by law, that public service should not be financially punitive, and that policy positions about taxing wealth are about systemic distribution rather than individual guilt. Cruz's best counter is to argue that public-facing moral language carries an implied obligation to demonstrate personal restraint, or at least personal awareness, because voters instinctively reject lectures from anyone who appears exempt from the consequences they prescribe. This layer is less about the exact number on a paycheck and more about perceived asymmetry, because asymmetry is what turns policy differences into resentment, and resentment is what turns a town hall into a credibility crisis. A careful rewrite also has to separate two ideas that your draft sometimes blends together: hypocrisy as moral failure and distance as structural reality. It is possible for a politician to be sincere about redistribution while still living a life shaped by elite networks, media incentives, and the practical necessities of national office, and sincerity can coexist with contradiction without proving malice. But it is also true that sincerity does not automatically protect credibility, because credibility depends on whether the audience feels the speaker understands their constraints without romanticizing them or using them as rhetorical fuel. In your scene, constituents are not furious because they learned a politician earns a salary. They are furious because the symbolism and the lifestyle cues feel like proof that the politician can step out of their world at will while still claiming to speak for it. That is why the most effective constituent lines are not policy lines, but dignity lines. Because "I donated and felt used" is a moral injury claim, and moral injury is far more politically destabilizing than disagreement. The HQ2 segment functions as the stories move from optics to consequences, because it claims the representative's choices affected tangible opportunity rather than merely narrative. To analyze it cleanly, you have to present it as a trade-off dispute. Supporters of the opposition to HQ2 argue that deals can be exploitative, that subsidies can be regressive, that growth can displace vulnerable residents, and that corporate bargaining power can erode local democratic control. Critics argue that job creation can be transformative, that opportunity matters in places where upward mobility is scarce, and that rejecting large investment can become a luxury belief when the people most desperate for jobs do not have the same ideological flexibility. Your Cruz character weaponizes that dispute by portraying the opposition as celebration of loss, because the celebratory tone, whether fair or not, reads as a representative taking joy in the absence of jobs that constituents hoped for. And once the dispute is framed as your ideological victory versus our material loss, the policy complexity collapses under the weight of a single emotional comparison, which is exactly what political persuasion does in moments of stress. The deeper layer in HQ is not simply whether Amazon would have delivered everything promised, because no projection is guaranteed, and political reality is always messier than headlines. The deeper layer is that jobs in working-class communities are not merely numbers. They represent time regained, medical stability, the ability to move out, the ability to plan. and the end of humiliation that comes from needing help you cannot ask for. So when the script puts a father imagining work alongside his son, it is not proving an economic model. It is illustrating how opportunity, even imagined, can serve as psychological oxygen. When that oxygen is removed, people often look for a face to attach to the loss, because the system is too abstract to punish, and elected officials are the only accessible embodiment of decision-making. This is why your town hall crowd turns from disappointment into accusation, because the crowd is performing the most basic democratic reflex. If you are our representative, you are accountable for what we perceive as our chances shrinking. The grandmother segment is where responsible writing becomes most important, because the difference between commentary and defamation risk often lives in whether you assert unverified details as fact. The safest way to preserve your meaning is to frame this as an ethical question about storytelling and fundraising in politics. When a politician shares family hardship publicly, what obligations exist to clarify what is being raised, where it goes, and what outcomes donors should expect? Cruz, in Your Construction, argues that the act of publicizing suffering becomes exploitative if it functions primarily as a visibility engine, while the underlying hardship persists, and he uses the persistence of hardship as rhetorical evidence that the story served politics more than relief. AOC's best defense, in a neutral frame, is that public attention can mobilize resources, that disaster recovery is slow, and that personal stories can be used to pressure institutions that have failed, even if repairs are not immediate. The scene becomes explosive because it merges two moral instincts that Americans hold simultaneously: compassion for family suffering and suspicion that politics monetizes compassion. And once those instincts collide, the speaker's intent is judged through the lens of trust rather than through the lens of procedure. The climate sacrifice segment then ties the story together by placing burden sharing at the center, because climate policy is fundamentally about burdens distributed across time, geography, class, and industry. Supporters argue burdens must be accepted to avoid worse burdens later, and that transition can be designed to protect workers, but opponents argue that mandates often land hardest on people with the fewest alternatives and the least cash buffer. Your script sides with the opponent's emotional framing by giving voice to practical constraints. The tradesperson with a van, the retirees with a paid-off car, the families for whom cheap protein is not a lifestyle choice, but a budget necessity. Cruz's final move is to describe a perceived elite exemption culture, where the messenger retains convenience while preaching austerity, because nothing destroys the moral authority of collective sacrifice faster than visible asymmetry. And in the logic of your narrative, this is the concluding proof that the conflict is not merely partisan, but structural. Politics increasingly asks ordinary people to absorb disruption while allowing the politically protected to treat disruption as a slogan. If you step back, the 5-round structure is doing something very specific. It is converting diffuse dissatisfaction into a coherent accusation by stacking examples that all rhyme with the same claim. Round 1 says the symbolism is not solidarity but status. Round 2 says the lifestyle signals distance. Round 3 says the policy stance cost opportunity. Round 4 says storytelling becomes extraction. Round 5 says sacrifice becomes asymmetric. AOC's identity in the script is therefore not attacked through ideology, but through alleged inconsistency, because inconsistency is easier for broad audiences to process than policy nuance and easier to remember than competing spreadsheets. Cruz's identity in the script is likewise not about policy, but about method, because he is presented as a prosecutor of hypocrisy rather than a legislator of alternatives, which is an important critique to include if you want the analysis to stay balanced. The audience, finally, is the amplifier, because their stories turn abstract claims into visceral stakes. And once the room becomes a moral jury, the outcome is decided less by rebuttal and more by whether the speaker can re-establish respect. At this stage of the analysis, the focus shifts away from individual episodes and toward the structural forces that make those episodes politically combustible. Because without understanding the incentives shaping modern political behavior, the confrontation risks being misread as merely personal rather than systemic. The figure at the center of this story is not simply a congresswoman, but a product of an attention economy in which visibility is power, virality is leverage, and moral language is often the fastest path to relevance. In such an environment, politicians are rewarded not for legislative patience or incremental compromise, but for moments that can be clipped, shared, and emotionally consumed. That reward structure does not require bad intentions to produce distortions, because even well-meaning actors begin optimizing for what keeps them visible rather than for what produces slow, often invisible, outcomes. The conflict in your script emerges precisely because the incentives of attention collide with the expectations of representation, and the collision happens in public, under economic pressure, with no buffer of abstraction. Alexandria-Ocasio-Cortez's rise is inseparable from this media environment, because her skill set aligns perfectly with its demands. She communicates fluently in the language of platforms, condensing complex moral critiques into accessible, emotionally resonant frames that younger voters recognize instantly. For many supporters, that fluency is not superficial, but empowering, because it allows them to see themselves reflected in national politics for the first time. However, that same fluency creates vulnerability, because when politics is mediated through images, those images become subject to the same scrutiny as policy outcomes. The very tools that accelerate visibility also accelerate backlash, because they flatten context and invite adversarial reinterpretation. Ted Cruz, by contrast, is written as a practitioner of a different political instinct, one shaped by law rather than platforms. His strategy in the confrontation is not to out-viral his opponent, but to slow the moment down, to turn images into exhibits, and to force the audience to sit with contradictions rather than scroll past them. This is not presented as moral superiority, but as tactical opposition, because adversarial framing is itself a form of performance, even when it wears the costume of restraint. The script implicitly critiques this as well, because prosecutorial politics can diagnose inconsistency without offering a coherent alternative vision. In that sense, the exchange is not a battle between truth and deception, but between two modes of persuasion that thrive under different conditions. The audience's role becomes clearer here, because they are not neutral observers, but active participants in meaning-making. Their reactions are shaped not only by what is said on stage, but by what they bring with them into the room: exhaustion, financial anxiety, and a growing sense that political language has drifted away from their daily constraints. When they respond emotionally, they are not necessarily rejecting progressive policy in the abstract, but expressing frustration with feeling instrumentalized. This distinction matters because it explains why similar rhetoric can inspire hope in one context and anger in another. Hope flourishes when people feel protected. Anger erupts when people feel exposed. The narrative's emphasis on dignity rather than ideology is therefore not accidental. Again and again, the constituent voices do not argue policy details. They ask whether they are being respected as full participants in the political project. They react most strongly when they believe their struggles are being aestheticized, turned into symbols rather than addressed as constraints. This is a critical insight for understanding modern political volatility, because dignity is often the first casualty of symbolic politics. Once dignity feels compromised, even accurate policy arguments lose traction. The cumulative effect of the 5 rounds is to create a sense of moral asymmetry that overwhelms technical defenses. Each example reinforces the idea that costs and benefits are unevenly distributed, and that those distributions track status more than rhetoric. Whether or not each claim holds under forensic scrutiny becomes almost secondary to the perception that the overall pattern feels true. Political credibility, especially in working-class contexts, is not adjudicated like a court case, but like a character assessment. When enough signals point in the same direction, rebuttals sound like excuses rather than explanations. This is where the analysis must widen again, because focusing exclusively on one figure risks missing the broader transformation underway in democratic politics. Social media has not simply added a new channel, it has altered the criteria by which leaders are selected, rewarded, and punished. Candidates who can generate attention rise faster, while those who build quiet competence struggle to break through. Moral clarity, or at least the appearance of it, is often more valuable than procedural effectiveness because it travels better across feeds. Over time, this dynamic selects for representatives whose primary skill is narrative control rather than coalition building. The danger, as your script illustrates, is that narrative control weakens when reality intrudes in unfiltered form. A town hall, especially one filled with constituents who do not speak in hashtags, disrupts the smoothness of online identity. Stories of shared shoes, rationed medicine, and stalled futures cannot be edited for tone or trimmed for engagement metrics. When those stories confront a carefully constructed persona, the resulting friction can be politically devastating. This is not because the persona is necessarily false, but because it cannot easily absorb unscripted human cost. From a policy perspective, the confrontation also reveals how easily complex trade-offs are reduced to moral binaries. Economic development becomes corporate greed versus community. Climate transition becomes planet versus people, and redistribution becomes justice versus selfishness. These binaries simplify communication but impoverish understanding, because they obscure the fact that most policies impose real costs even when they promise long-term benefits. When leaders speak as if sacrifice is painless or evenly shared, they unintentionally signal detachment from lived constraint. That signal, once received, is difficult to retract. The analysis does not require concluding that the progressive project is illegitimate, because ideological disagreement is not the same as ethical failure. What it does require is acknowledging that persuasion fails when language outruns credibility. If a politician demands collective sacrifice, they must demonstrate not moral purity but proportionality and empathy that are visible rather than asserted. Empathy, in this context, is not an emotion but a practice, shown through restraint, acknowledgement of trade-offs, and refusal to trivialize loss. Without those signals, even necessary reforms will be interpreted as elite impositions rather than collective decisions. By the end of the main body, the confrontation has revealed less about one individual's character than about the fragility of representation in a mediated age. When politics is filtered through performance, authenticity becomes both more valuable and more vulnerable. The audience's withdrawal of trust is not instantaneous, but cumulative, built from moments that feel small in isolation and overwhelming in aggregate. This is why the script's ending does not hinge on a single devastating revelation, but on the exhaustion of defense itself. Once people feel they are being managed rather than represented, disengagement or backlash becomes rational rather than emotional. In closing the main body, the key analytical conclusion is that the crisis depicted is not partisan, but structural. It arises wherever political incentives reward spectacle over stewardship, and wherever moral language is deployed faster than material relief. The town hall becomes a microcosm of a broader democratic tension. Citizens demand meaning, dignity, and fairness, while institutions increasingly deliver symbols, narratives, and optimization for attention. Bridging that gap requires more than sharper messaging. It requires rebalancing incentives so that credibility is earned through shared constraint rather than declared through slogans. Until that rebalance occurs, similar confrontations will continue to erupt, not because voters are cynical, but because they are paying closer attention than ever before. The confrontation you constructed ultimately resolves into a lesson about credibility rather than ideology, because the audience is not weighing competing economic theories so much as deciding whether the messenger feels bound by the same limits as the people being addressed. When political language accelerates faster than lived improvement, trust erodes not through argument, but through fatigue. Because voters grow tired of explaining away contradictions on behalf of leaders who no longer seem to notice them. This is why the town hall does not end with a single decisive rebuttal, but with a collective sense that something intangible has been lost, something closer to respect than agreement. The most damaging outcome for any representative is not being proven wrong on policy, but being perceived as insulated from the consequences of their own rhetoric. Once that perception hardens, every future explanation is filtered through suspicion rather than good faith. The story also clarifies how modern political conflict is shaped less by legislation than by incentives, particularly the incentives created by an attention economy that rewards moral clarity over operational complexity. In such an environment, symbolic victories are easier to communicate than incremental gains, and cultural moments often substitute for policy outcomes in the public imagination. This substitution can feel empowering at first, especially to supporters who crave representation and visibility, but it becomes corrosive when symbols begin to stand in for material progress indefinitely. What begins as a tool for mobilization risks turning into a trap because leaders become dependent on performance even as constituents grow impatient for results. The resulting gap between narrative and reality is where backlash is born. Equally important is the role of adversarial politics, embodied here by a figure who understands how to exploit that gap without necessarily offering a constructive alternative. Cross-examination can expose inconsistency, but exposure alone does not govern, and it can deepen polarization if it becomes an end in itself. The danger is not that hypocrisy is called out, because accountability is essential, but that politics devolves into a permanent trial where every action is evidence and no outcome is resolution. In that world, voters are trained to expect scandal rather than service, and leaders are trained to manage optics rather than build durable coalitions. The confrontation, then, is both a warning and a symptom of a system that privileges conflict over continuity. The constituent voices in your narrative are the most revealing element because they articulate a demand that transcends party labels. They are not asking for perfection, ideological purity, or even agreement on every policy choice. They are asking for recognition that their constraints are real, non-negotiable, and not interchangeable with slogans. They respond most intensely when they feel their hardship has been converted into content, when struggle becomes a backdrop rather than a problem to be solved. That response is not radical. It is deeply conservative in the literal sense, seeking to conserve dignity in a system that often treats it as expendable. From a broader democratic perspective, the episode illustrates how representation falters when leaders mistake visibility for consent. Social media creates the illusion of constant engagement. But engagement is not the same as accountability, and followers are not the same as constituents. When leaders speak primarily to a national audience while governing a local one, misalignment becomes almost inevitable. The local audience measures success in jobs, stability, and predictability, while the national audience rewards moral signaling and narrative dominance. Navigating that split requires discipline, restraint, and an explicit acknowledgement of trade-offs, all of which are difficult to sustain in a hyper-mediated environment. The lesson is not that ambitious reform is impossible or that progressive goals are inherently disconnected from working-class interests. Rather, it is that reform cannot be sustained on symbolism alone, and that moral language must be grounded in visible, shared sacrifice to retain legitimacy. When leaders ask for patience, they must show urgency. When they ask for sacrifice, they must show proportionality. Absent those demonstrations, even sincere intentions are reinterpreted as privilege, and even sound policies are rejected as impositions. Politics, in the end, is not judged by how eloquently it speaks about justice, but by how convincingly it shares burden. As the analysis closes, what remains is not a verdict on a single figure, but a cautionary outline of where democratic politics is drifting. If performance continues to outrun substance, and if attention continues to outweigh accountability, similar confrontations will multiply across parties and movements. Voters will become less persuadable and more punitive, not because they are cynical, but because they are adapting to a system that has trained them to expect spectacle. Reversing that trend requires more than better messaging. It requires rebuilding trust through alignment between words, conduct, and consequence. Until that alignment is restored, every slogan risks becoming an exhibit, and every town hall risks becoming a trial rather than a conversation.